Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I really appreciate my colleagues questioning on the fraud, the amazing amount of fraud that we've seen. Administrator Guzman, you're painting a picture that small businesses across the country are thriving, but I don't see that being any farther from the truth. Every single small business that I talk to in North Texas is struggling from high inflation and an overburdensome regulatory environment. Mr. Lugemeyer's questioning, are you talking to the president? It wasn't sarcastic. He asked that question because we legitimately want to know who is talking to the administration, who is the voice of small businesses in the president's ear. Because what I'm seeing, at least in my district, and I'll tell you, we've had a lot of people who've come to this small business hearings and have told us the exact same thing. Their wishes, their concerns, their priorities are not being reflected in this administration's priorities or their agenda. In fact, they're being immediately hurt. In your testimony, you said under your leadership that you put guardrails to stop fraud, and yet the SBA decided to stop collecting PPP loans that exceeded a balance of $100,000, not grants, but loans. That led to $4.6 billion in potentially fraudulent PPP loans. We've seen $78.1 billion in potential fraud in EIDL loans, and then $1.1 billion in SBA loans. And you're refusing to collect on that. Do you think that should stop fraud?
I can address that last part first. Those loans, $100,000 and under, first off, with separate fraud from those $100,000 and under, any loan, whatever size, will be pursued for fraud. And we continue to flag all of those loans for the IG.
How do you know?
For pursuit. We've actually reviewed all of our 12 million loans within the PPP program to ensure that we identify.
So how much then do we, since you looked at every single one of them and you know which ones are fraud and which ones aren't, how much is it in fraud and fraudulent?
We're still continuing to flag loans and refer them over to the IG. We've so far to date referred tens of thousands. But just because a loan has an indicator of fraud does that does not mean it's going to be fraud. And so there's a lot of work and analysis that has to go in play, and so we'll know as time moves on.
But how do you know if you're not even going back, if you're counting them as grants and not loans? How do you even know?
They continue to have a flag, so they're not forgiven, they're not removed until we can identify whether or not they're fraud. So we and I will speak though to the 100,000 and under, and just let you know that obviously we take fraud seriously, as well as those who misuse the program. We also have to be good, prudent.
And I appreciate that. Do you think you're ever going to get this money back?
We have been able to successfully.
How much of the nearly $85 billion in fraud have we gotten back?
Overall, inclusive of all clawbacks, is $29 billion at the IG.
So the $85 billion we've received $29 billion back?
I don't know the $85 billion and what specifically that includes.
So $4.6 billion PPP loans, $78.1 billion in EIDL, and $1.1 in SBA loans.
What the IG says is that we've been able to recover $29.5 billion across PPP and EIDL in collaboration with.
So what are they doing with those
funds? The funds either initially went back to the SBA or to the Treasury, but of course all those funds, as the program has been closed for quite some time, have been returned. So
we've got $29 billion that we need to.
No, that actually has already been clawed back, and I know that it has been used and already either redirected to another program or taken back to Treasury. So there's no more funds at the SBA to use.
Okay. So the SBA received $3.4 billion at the beginning of the pandemic. That was to be an assistance for COVID relief programs, right? When you took office, half of that hadn't even been spent yet. So as of January 21st, right before you took office, SBA had hired 6,000 temporary employees for the office that runs the EIDL program. They had hired an additional 400 for the PPP program. How are we looking at $85 billion worth of fraud when we hired all of those people and we're still trying to get those dollars back? And what are you doing to make sure that doesn't happen again?
Yeah, and unfortunately in 2020, when those programs were deployed, there were not the same controls that we implemented in 2021, including on the EIDL program, not checking and validating tax returns, not checking the Treasury do not pay list. We implemented those controls. So when you hear records of fraud, it's the entire portfolio. We don't separate from administration to administration.
But you would have dates on the fraud.
We have, I'm sorry, what?
You would have dates on the fraud.
Correct. And so
can you
we've
provide
implemented.
Can you provide this committee of the 85 billion potential in fraud when that was committed?
I don't know what the 85 billion is, but we're happy to work with you closely
I yield back my time.
to
Thank you
figure
very
out.
much.